Now, I'm going to bring in our next guest, Emma Jo Morris, in a moment to talk about those extraordinary hearings this week where we saw Attorney General Merrick Garland get absolutely grilled by Congress about the way the Justice Department has been politicized by the Biden administration, and especially the claims that the FBI and other agencies have become a de facto Praetorian Guard for the Democrats, protecting those who are in the family while going after their enemies. Now, it didn't go well for the Attorney General, and nor should it have. Here's how Merrick Garland answered the question about whether he had had any personal contact with anyone at the FBI about the investigations into Hunter Biden.
Have you had personal contact with anyone at FBI headquarters about the Hunter Biden investigation?
I don't recollect the answer to that question, but the FBI works for the Justice Department.
I'm sorry. You don't recollect whether you've talked with anybody at FBI headquarters about an investigation into the president's son?
I don't believe that I did.
He also claimed to have no knowledge at all about the millions of dollars that had been moved through Biden family shell companies.
Do you know about the money that moved through Rob Walker's shell companies, yes or no?
As I have said repeatedly, I have left these matters to Mr. Weiss. I've not intruded. I've not interfered. I've not tried to find out what he knows.
It's like you're looking the other way on purpose because everybody knows this stuff's happening. And you know what? People don't pay bribes to not get something in return. Right? The China initiative resulted in the convictions of a Harvard professor, of someone at Monsanto. So we were working against the Chinese. They paid the Bidens. And now you're sitting here telling me that North Korea is the big threat.
Sounds like Merrick Garland hasn't been watching the U.S. report. And then there was this.
Our job is not to do what is politically convenient. Our job is not to take orders from the president, from Congress, or from anyone else about who or what to criminally investigate.
Sure, Mr. Garland, I believe you. Millions wouldn't. Joining me to discuss this now is politics editor at Breitbart News, Emma Jo Morris. Emma Jo, thank you so much here. Those were just a few highlights, but what else did we learn from these hearings with Merrick Garland this week?
Well, that's the thing, is we didn't learn very much, right? As the audience just saw in those clips, and those clips quite perfectly summed up that whole hearing, which was, it's this slippery, evasive, lawyered language where, there's no real straight answer that's given on any particular question, especially not regarding the Hunter stuff. And it's all kind of padded so that if something does come to light, that contradicts any of his statements, they're vague enough where he could say, for instance, he says, oh, I don't recall whether I've had a conversation with anybody about Hunter Biden's investigations. You don't remember? Like, how do you not remember that conversation, right? And so, but by saying that, you create a scenario where if it does come to light that somebody comes forward and says there was actually this conversation that happened, he didn't technically perjure himself in front of Congress, and just today, there was a report that an IRS whistleblower has now come forward again to Congress in a transcribed interview, according to a report in the Washington Examiner, I believe, where he said, Merrick Garland said in Congress that he didn't have any say in whether David Weiss, the now special counsel who's investigating Hunter, whether David Weiss would bring charges. And, this whistleblower says otherwise, that actually DOJ tax division would have to sign off on anything brought against Hunter. So this just keeps happening because he's not being straight, and there's nothing to glean from this hearing. As far as I'm concerned, it's a big theatrical exercise. It's like a 3-hour performance art, because this guy isn't really giving any concrete answers to anything because he can't.
Yeah, and one of the things I thought that was really interesting watching it was that the way that he kept trying to defend the special counsel David Weiss, claiming that, he's a Trump holdover, so he can't somehow be somebody who's protecting the Bidens. And yet every single step of the way, all of the evidence points to David Weiss slow-walking investigations into things that should take 2 seconds to figure out, like whether or not Hunter made a false statement on a gun license application or something like that. Stuff that suddenly takes 5 years.
Which, by the way, we reported at the New York Post we reported that in the New York Post 3 years ago, sorry, it was obvious, you know, and obviously David Weiss has his own problems. He's totally slow walking the more serious charges like FARA violations, foreign agent violations. But I like that logic, and I find that really interesting because if that is the way that this all works, then Garland, the Biden appointee, must also be operating on some sort of bias according to who appoints him. So good to know.
Yeah. Well, exactly right. And of course, we had also now the news that Hunter Biden is going to enter a plea of not guilty to those charges of lying about being a crack addict when he bought that gun in 2018. What does that, what position does that throw that whole case into? Because as far as I'm concerned, this case is a massive distraction while the clock runs out on the really serious stuff that, if investigators properly pulled the thread on, would lead them back to the Oval Office.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think that the main thing to glean, you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm just like analyzing this politically, and I think the main thing to glean from this case is that it's all a sideshow. It's all a distraction because if you notice, that's the one thing that doesn't involve Joe Biden. Every single other path that you take down the Hunter Biden story ends at Joe Biden. And so somehow we're all here talking about this gun charge, which I guess like does carry some prison time, and it is a crime, and that stuff, you know, should go prosecuted, and that's, I guess, sort of a win, but, you know, just a win in terms of not coming to get Hunter, because I don't really care about that, but it more just about equal, you know, application of justice. But we're talking about one of the biggest corruption scandals in American history, and somehow a gun charge is the focus. I mean, it's all just, it feels so silly. And, you know, the thing about the Trump appointee line is you have conservatives and you have liberals in Washington, and that's fine. But that isn't the real, I don't think, you know, that isn't the real paradigm in American politics. The real paradigm in American politics is not left versus right. It's establishment versus populist. And no matter where you go in Washington, it doesn't matter if the person is working in the Bush administration or the Reagan administration, or they were working in the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, it doesn't matter. Or they were appointed by Trump. If they're coming from Washington, there's a certain type that's in Washington. And they could be conservative or they could be liberal. It doesn't matter. They are a big, happy family in Washington. And conservative, liberal, that's all secondary. They are protecting each other. And Joe Biden is the living embodiment of that establishment. And he is going to be protected by his people.
Emma Jo, you nailed it right there. It's all about the politics of tribe. Thank you so much.